It began on a gray sky morning with frost on the shutters and a quiet woman brushing lint from her coat. The street outside the Grand Palais bloomed with noise. Heels tapped like typewriters. Cameras blinked like fireflies. Laughter, sharp as a champagne, scattered among perfume clouds and velvet scarves. But the woman with the handmade shawl walked as if through snow. Slow, unfazed. Her eyes tracing the arches of the building more than the people rushing past her. She wore a coat of mossy brown wool, its buttons mismatched, the hem carefully hand-stitched in a subtle scallop no one else would notice. Over her shoulders a shawl, faded plum, soft from wear, its edges bordered by a pattern so delicate it could have been mistaken for shadows. In this sea of curated extravagance she looked unfinished. Or perhaps too finished, like something time forgot to commercialize. No one stopped her. Not really. A few turned to stare, half curious, half dismissive. An older woman at fashion, weak was already an oddity, but one without gloss or designer logos, she slipped past them like fog. She paused beneath the ironwork beside the red-carpeted entrance and tilted her head to study a model stepping from a car. Silk, high collar, a line of silver embroidery down the back. The woman murmured something, a shake of her head. Not quite right, though no one heard. She didn't have an invitation, not visibly, but she moved forward anyway, eyes full of something that wasn't ambition, wasn't hope, just memory. She reached the entrance, and that's when the voice behind her cleared its throat. Madame? Excuse me, do you have credentials? She turned, her face quiet as linen, and blinked up at the young man in a black suit with a headset clipped to his ear. His voice was kind but brittle, used to performance. She said nothing, only opened her small satchel and pulled out a folded envelope. It was blank, worn at the corners. He frowned, confused, before glancing to a nearby woman in a headset. A pause, then another guard came. Sorry, madame, the second one said gently, gesturing with his hand. You'll need to come with us. The woman didn't argue. She simply looked down at the envelope, folded it once more, and tucked it back into her satchel like it mattered. Then she stepped aside, following them toward the curb. Her steps were even, but her eyes lingered on the open doors of the Grand Palais where light spilled like champagne onto the marble. Inside the music had begun. A dress, long, dramatic, sharp at the shoulder, auntie swept by. She watched it like a mother might watch a grown child, unable to call out but full of thought. Her mouth opened, but she only said, "Not quite right." A whisper to no one. The guards left her near the barricades, not harshly, not cruelly, just confused. She nodded to them in thanks, then stood, wrapped in her plum shawl as people streamed past, unaware that the woman they'd dismissed had once designed gowns that made royalty weep. A few feet away, someone was watching. Eloise didn't know why the woman held her attention. At first she thought it was the shawl, then the coat, then the way the woman's hands folded. Not nervously, but precisely, like a tailor smoothing a bodice. And then she saw it. The stitch. A tiny curved stitch at the edge of the shawl where the thread doubled back so delicately it seemed woven by breath. Eloise blinked. Looked again. She recognized it, but she didn't know how. Her mentor, Madame Rousseau, had once told her a story over tea in a dusty atelier. There was a stitch so fine, she had said, you couldn't tell where it began or ended. It was hers, the one who disappeared. Who? Eloise had asked. Madame Rousseau. Only smiled. You wouldn't know her name? Most don't, but I still wear a collar she made. And when I forget who I am, I run my fingers over that seam. Now Eloise stared at the shawl. Her heart ticked strangely. She stepped forward, as if to say something, but the woman turned then, not looking at her, and walked away, coat swinging softly at her calves. The crowd swelled again. Eloise was bumped by an influencer with sequined boots, caught in the wave of photographers chasing some star. She lost sight of the woman. But something fluttered to the ground where she had stood. A handkerchief. Eloise bent to pick it up. It was pale blue old cotton, hand-stitched with a tiny M in the corner. The embroidery was faint, like something that had been wept on too often, folded too many times. She held it in her palm. It felt like a story. And in the distance the woman disappeared behind a row of sycamores, the hem of her coat catching the light like the end of a sentence not yet finished. The rain began just as the models walked, and somewhere across the city a kettle whistled in a quiet flat. Long ago, before her name was a whisper behind velvet ropes, she was simply Marguerite. In the 1980s, Paris had a different color to it. More smoke, more soul. And on Rue des Martyrs, tucked between a florist and a forgotten cinema, was a narrow atelier that smelled of bergamot and chalk. Morning began the same way each day. Record player on low, something stringed and aching, a cup of orange pico, steeped exactly 5 minutes, and a small envelope opened with trembling care. Inside, always the same paper, always the same ink, always a letter to Camille. Her sister, gone too soon. She wrote to her as though she might write back. Each letter folded and placed in a blue box lined with lavender cloth. She didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but she believed in ritual. And in that stillness, before pins and scissors and steam, she found her center. Then came the fabric. Touch first, eyes second. Marguerite worked like a poet, the kind who read no critics, only hands. Her designs didn't shout. They hummed. She stitched like someone mending the world. She was precise, reverent, slow. One spring, a girl began to visit. 8, maybe 9, with hair like dark rain and a voice barely there. The girl was her niece, Camille's daughter. Her name was Sabine. She came on weekends at first, then weekdays. Marguerite taught her to thread a needle before she could spell couture. They made little things, a sachet, a doll's coat, then a real one, lined in silk scrap. Sabine laughed when she wore it. A small, surprised laugh like she hadn't expected it to fit her so well. Marguerite watched her and felt the ache of love she thought she'd buried with Camille. But nothing gold stays. Not in stories, not in cities like this. Sabine's father remarried, moved to the south, new wife, new name, new home. The girl didn't get to say goodbye. Marguerite never stopped sewing, but she folded the girl's last drawing into the blue letterbox. And the box, once full of letters to Camille, grew heavier with silence. Now in the present, the city blurred beneath gray skies. Eloise sat in a narrow bookstore with fabric samples spread around her like a makeshift shrine. In her lap, the handkerchief. She hadn't stopped thinking about that stitch, the curve of it, the impossible delicacy. She found a name buried deep in an online archive. Marguerite Leroux, Atelier des Fins, Rue des Martyrs, 1982-1991. Defunct. Gone. But the name stayed with her. She scribbled it on the edge of her notebook, circled it, and made a list of every place that might remember. One name stood out. Armand Dupont, tailor, retired. Now working out of a tiny back room near Belleville, mostly hemming pants for neighbors who paid in wine or stories. She found him bent over a pair of navy slacks, muttering to himself. "Pardon, monsieur," she said gently, holding out the sketch she'd copied from the shawl's edge. He adjusted, his glasses, then looked up. His face went still. Where did you see this? She hesitated. A woman. Outside the Palais. He held up a finger, then turned to the shelf behind him. From a faded album he pulled a swatch of cream silk. At its edge, the same stitch. She was never loud, he said, sitting down slowly. But she could sew silence into silk. Eloise leaned forward, breath shallow. What happened to her? She stopped speaking. But not sewing. We just stopped looking. Across the river, Marguerite sat in a small cafe beneath a striped awning, sketching in her book as drops of rain tapped the windows like quiet guests. She no longer cared if anyone saw her sketches. She no longer signed them. But she drew every day. Dresses that curved like memory. Sleeves that carried secrets. Coats built for women who had nothing to prove. A boy passed the window wearing her old silhouette. Reinterpreted, loud with logos. She didn't blame him. He didn't know. But still she sighed and turned the page. Her cappuccino cooled beside her. The table was cluttered with buttons, threads, a thimble she'd used for 30 years. She hummed under her breath. Not a song, but a rhythm, steady and familiar. The rain softened. Her hand paused. Across the street, someone darted by, holding a phone in one hand and a magazine in the other. The magazine cover showed Eloise's latest collection, a dress. The shoulder curved in a way Marguerite had once taught Sabine. She felt her chest stir, almost painfully. In another cafe, Eloise sat across from a woman with white hair and red lipstick, sipping Earl Grey like it was brandy. A former fashion editor, sharp eyes dulled only slightly with age. Why did she vanish? Eloise asked softly. The woman tapped ash from her cigarette. Because the world didn't listen when she whispered, so she stopped speaking. Eloise was silent. The handkerchief sat on the table between them. She was a designer, the editor added. No, she was a prayer. But we wanted parades. She gave us grace and we wanted glitter. Outside, the rain slowed to a hush, and somewhere not far Marguerite rose from her seat, sketchbook pressed to her chest like a held breath. Somewhere in the back of a drawer, beneath buttons and mothballs, was a letter never sent. The return address was smudged, but the handwriting was deliberate. On a cold Thursday morning, Marguerite opened her narrow mailbox and found it waiting. No fanfare, no sender's name, just her own scrawled in soft blue ink. To Marguerite, if you're still sewing. Inside, the paper was thick, hand-cut. Not flashy, intentional. The letter itself was plain-spoken, tender. It thanked her, though it never said exactly for what. It didn't ask for mentorship. It asked only for tea. A chance to talk stitches, if not stories, the letter said. If your afternoons are still slow and your tea still warm. She read it once, then again, then tucked it into her coat pocket and went about her day as though it hadn't opened a door she had bolted shut long ago. She didn't write back. Instead, she rose early the next morning and retrieved her old scissors from the bottom of her closet. She cleared her table of unpaid bills and brittle catalogs and laid out a bolt of soft gray wool she'd been saving for years. Then she began again, not where she'd left off, but further in. As though her hands remembered something her mind had refused to hold. Across town in the cramped living room of her apartment, Eloise folded fabric with slow reverence. She didn't expect a reply, but she hoped. And hope has its own pulse. That night Marguerite dreamed of thread, thin and gleaming, stretching through a hallway of closed doors. In 1991, the hallway had been real. It led to a narrow backstage corridor at her last show. The venue was too big, the lighting wrong. Her name was spelled incorrectly on the invitations. Someone had ordered champagne. She'd asked for tea, She watched from the wings as the first model stepped onto the runway in a jacket she'd sewn by hand, every pleat intentional, every line like breath. The model hesitated. Her heel caught the edge of the curtain. She faltered, gasps, then chuckles. Marguerite closed her eyes. The collection had been too quiet for that room. She had known it. Still, she had hoped. The third model wore a coat lined with a secret, one phrase stitched in silk along the hem. To speak softly is not to disappear. No one noticed. By the time the show ended, the press had already decided. Too nostalgic. Too still. Fashion has moved on. Investors pulled their offers. One assistant cried quietly in the stairwell. Marguerite said nothing. She folded each piece with care and walked home in silence. The next day she locked the atelier and left the city for a while. When she returned, it was only to sew in solitude. Not for runways, not for rooms. Years later she passed the old atelier on impulse. The sign was gone. In its place, Chaussures Bernard, a cobbler. She stepped inside, pretending to browse. A boy with glue on his sleeves greeted her. She asked lightly if the attic was still there. He hesitated, then pointed her toward the stairs. She climbed slowly. Dust clung to the railing. The door stuck, but it opened. The attic smelled of cedar and dust. Old things. She found remnants of her past like forgotten fingerprints, a broken iron, boxes of worn muslin. And in the corner, beneath a sheet, her mannequin stood like an old friend. Pinned to its shoulder was a yellowed scrap of paper, curled at the corners. For when you return, it read. She sat beside it, quiet for a long time. In the days that followed, Marguerite stitched in the early mornings, listening to Edith Piaf on low volume and watching the light change against her walls. The city hadn't softened, but she no longer needed it to. Her stitches were smaller now, sharper, but just as sure. Eloise waited. She returned to the cafe where she'd seen Marguerite sketching in the rain. She brought a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, a spool of silver thread and an envelope embossed with her name. No pressure, no questions. Just, to Marguerite, from someone still learning how to listen. The barista placed it behind the counter with a nod. Eloise sat outside with her tea, watching the clouds shift over the Seine. She didn't look for Marguerite. She just waited a little while longer, believing not in answers but in returns. The night of Eloise's show, the air was cold. Not the harsh kind that bites, but the sort that makes everything feel closer to the skin. The kind of night where breath turns to mist and eyes shine with anticipation. The venue was a converted train station on the edge of the city, marble echoing beneath designer heels, cameras clicking in intervals like metronomes. Inside, the lights were low. A hush fell just before the music began. Not the loud, pulsing kind most shows favored, but something quieter. A piano. One key at a time. Intentional. The audience, elite and unreadable, leaned in. The early pieces were sharp, confident. Echoes of the old masters with a pulse of something new. Silhouettes that whispered homage. But it was the final piece that changed the air. A model stepped slowly down the runway, draped in a shawl the color of fog and quiet hope. It moved like memory, soft and certain. Along its edge, the invisible stitch gleamed for those who knew how to look. At first there was silence, not confusion, reverence. The kind of silence that only art, real art, can pull from a room full of people who rarely give it. At the very back of the room, standing beside a pillar and barely noticeable, Marguerite watched. Her coat was plain, her hands tucked into her sleeves, her face unreadable. But her eyes followed the shawl like a thread tracing its own return. She hadn't planned to come. She hadn't planned anything. But there she was. Her name wasn't on the program. It didn't need to be. Because her stitch, the one no one was supposed to remember, shimmered in the light like a secret finally spoken aloud. Someone in the crowd gasped. A woman in the third row leaned to her neighbor. A man narrowed his eyes. Whispers traveled, quiet and searching. Not everyone understood, but those who did turned. It wasn't a shout or an announcement. It was recognition without spectacle. A shared breath of knowing. Marguerite blinked once. A single tear caught on her lower lash but did not fall. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even joy. It was something older. Something like return. From the other end of the room, Eloise saw her. No smile, no tears. Just a quiet certainty in her step as she walked toward the back, as though the show were still going but she no longer needed to perform. When she reached Marguerite, she didn't speak. She didn't ask questions. She simply reached into her pocket and pulled out a needle. She held it out. Marguerite took it. A gown with an extended train passed nearby. A deliberate, slow walk. Marguerite stepped forward, crouched slightly, and began to stitch. One thread. Then another. The crowd, realizing what was happening, stood, not all at once but in quiet acknowledgement. No spotlight turned toward her, no name announced. But everyone knew. The gown carried her new stitch down the runway. One no longer invisible, but still subtle. Not shouted, whispered. When the final model disappeared into the wings and the lights dimmed, Marguerite stepped back. No applause chased her. It wasn't that kind of moment. Instead, the silence deepened. The kind that doesn't beg for claps but earns stillness. She walked to the exit. The same door she had been led through years ago. Her voice dismissed as too soft, her silence mistaken for absence. This time she opened it herself. She walked out alone, but not unseen. The street was nearly empty. Her shawl drawn close, breath misting before her. She didn't look back. And somewhere down the boulevard behind the cafe where once she had sketched in silence, the bells of a distant cathedral rang. Not for her, but for something that had returned. A girl behind her whispered to a friend. She didn't need to come back loud. She came back right. Sometimes the loudest stories are sown in silence. If this story touched you, subscribe or share where you're watching from. These stories matter.